Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benajmin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. For more than a decade, Syria was Russia's most reliable ally in the Middle East. Not a convenient partner or a situational alignment, but a pillar. Damascus gave Moscow what it could not secure anywhere else: permanent military infrastructure on the Eastern Mediterranean, political loyalty in international forums, and a regime willing to trade sovereignty for survival. And now, in less than a week, more than a decade of Kurdish self-rule was dismantled in the country's northeast. And in the background of this rapid consolidation of power sits another unresolved question. What happens to Russia in Syria now that the regime it builds its Middle East strategy around no longer exists? Well, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Reuters reported on Monday, citing 5 Syrian sources, that Russia has initiated a withdrawal of troops from the Qamishli airport in northeastern Syria. Located in the Kurdish region, the airbase has long served as a key logistics hub. Analysts believe that this move could signal the end of the Kremlin's military presence in the region, noting that Russian troops have been stationed at the Qamishli airport since 2019. Military equipment and heavy weapons were also reportedly transferred to another airbase on Syria's west coast, with some Russian troops expected to relocate there and others expected to return to Russia. This comes as the new Syrian government under Ahmed al-Sharaa has pushed to establish control over the entirety of the country, with loyal military units capturing large portions of northern and eastern territory from Kurdish-led forces. Since assuming power in January 2025, al-Sharaa has indicated that Syria is prepared to continue cooperation with Russia and allow Russian military bases to remain. However, experts believe that the Syrian government is politically distancing itself from Moscow. Vladimir Putin is hosting al-Sharaa in Moscow this Wednesday to discuss a transitional period in Syria, as well as other regional developments. The meeting is part of a broader working visit to Russia, in which al-Sharaa is expected to address the direction of bilateral relations with Syria.
And now, let's zone in on the East planning portion of our show. Russia's reported withdrawal from northern Syria is a seemingly abrupt change of policy. The Kremlin historically positioned itself as Syria's ultimate broker, striking pragmatic deals with multiple forces, including the Kurds. Let's have a closer look at the historical political dynamic between Russia and the Kurds.
Since Russia's 2015 intervention in Syria, the Kremlin has expanded its role as a power broker in the country by negotiating arrangements with multiple actors, including Kurdish political leaders, as part of a broader effort to restore Syrian state influence. Moscow leveraged partial US military withdrawals to counter Turkish advances in northern Syria and position itself as the primary mediator among competing forces. Unlike the United States, Turkey and Iran, which pursued exclusive zones of influence, Russia showed a consistent willingness since 2015 to share control and strike transactional agreements. For the Kurds, engagement with Russia was driven by security considerations rather than alignment. Having been abandoned by both Washington and Moscow during past Turkish operations, Kurdish leaders were hedging between external powers to secure protection from Turkey and recognition of limited autonomy. Damascus responded cautiously, signaling resistance to Kurdish self-rule but avoiding open rejection of the Russian-mediated process. However, this dynamic is seemingly changing. As Russian forces reportedly leave northern Syria, Moscow's influence in the country may be coming to an end.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. The fall of Bashar al-Assad and the rise of Ahmed al-Sharaa, an Islamist military strongman emerging from the jihadist ecosystem, mark a structural break in Russian-Syrian relations. Not because Russia suddenly lost interest in Syria, but because Syria stopped being the kind of client state Russia knows how to manage. Under Assad, the relationship was simple. Moscow protected the regime diplomatically at the UN, military in the air, and logistically through Tartus and convenient bases. In return, Russia enjoyed freedom of maneuver across the Levant, the Mediterranean, and onward into Africa. Syria was not just an ally, it was a platform. The Hamimim air base enables sustained Russian air operations, while Tartus, Russia's only naval foothold on the Mediterranean, anchored its permanent naval presence and secured NATO's southern flank from Moscow's perspective. Their role became even more important after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That entire model depended on one thing: a regime with no alternatives. Ahmed al-Sharaa does not fit that description. Since taking power, his government has signaled a deliberate effort to diversify Syria's foreign relations. Under al-Sharaa, the country will not want to be rebuilt exclusively by a sanctioned, cash-strapped Russia. The recent confrontation with the Kurdish forces is part of the same logic. By forcing them either to integrate or be dismantled, Damascus is reasserting territorial control and presenting itself as a sovereign central authority. For Moscow, it is a warning sign that Syria is no longer structurally dependent on Russian protection to impose order. Russia intervened militarily in Syria in 2015 to save Assad and prevent a Western-backed regime change. It succeeded militarily, but the political outcome unraveled eventually. When Assad fled to Russia, Moscow lost not just a client, but operational autonomy over Syrian territory. See, that loss became visible almost immediately. Satellite imagery from December 2024 showed Russia evacuating advanced air defense systems and helicopters from Syria to eastern Libya, to bases controlled by Khalifa Haftar. Now, this was not a full withdrawal, but it was a repositioning under pressure. Moscow was no longer acting from a position of strength. Today, Russia maintains a reduced presence at Hamimim and only symbolic access to Tartus. Russian warships have left the port. This is presence without control, access without ownership. Negotiations between Moscow and Damascus continue, but the leverage has flipped. Russia's priority is clear: preserve at least partial functionality of its military infrastructure. Syria's priority is equally clear: avoid overdependence on a declining partner. A little over a year after Assad's fall, Russian-Syrian relations are defined by uncertainty. No clear rupture, just managed ambiguity. And in Syria's new order, ambiguity increasingly favors Damascus, not Moscow. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Vladimir von Wilgenberg, journalist and author, Kurdish expert. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for the invitation.
So much of the world has been focused on Russia's action and its impact on the West. However, there's also a very significant footprint in the Middle East as well, which has been dwindling in recent days, seeing that they've been pulling out their forces from several Syrian air bases. So I would like to discuss this topic twofold. One of it being, how that has impacted Russia's standing in the West, and also what are the impacts that's going to have in the Middle East.
Well, amidst fighting between Kurdish forces and the SDF, the Russians, they pulled out forces from the base in Qamishlo. But at the same time, they still have a big base on the coast in Syria. And also there's a meeting, upcoming meeting between the Syrian interim president and Putin soon in Moscow. Mm-hmm. So despite that Russia supported the Assad regime, Russia still has ties to the new government basically in Syria.
Right. Do you think that this move has something to do with draining of resources with the war in Ukraine, or is it more of a development in what's happening just outside of that context within the Middle East alone?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that the Assad regime fell so easily is because Russia was occupied with fighting in Ukraine. Mm. So it's definitely related to each other. And what basically Russia is trying to do is to keep its bases in the Mediterranean. And that's why it's still trying to keep its relations with the new government in Syria. So definitely everything is related to each other. So there's a strong link still between Russia and Syria, despite of the events.
And how do you see these things turning out as, Russians have been pulling out their troops from their airways? Do you think that they will still retain some level of stranglehold on the region, or will it create a vacuum for other powers to come in?
Well, I mean, after the fall of the Assad regime, the strongest international powers in Syria are basically Turkey and Israel. And Russia's role has been strongly diminished. The only thing what they're basically trying to do is to still gain some access to their bases in Syria. So basically, they're still trying to keep their bases in Syria, but they don't have effective control anymore over Damascus. And the most influence now, what you can see, is basically Turkey, that has a strong link with the new government in Damascus, and Israel, that has a link with the Druze and is very influential in the south, and actually created a buffer zone there.
Right. And well, we also like to touch on your expertise, because we're looking at the Kurdish population over there, with the foreign audience perhaps not knowing that much about it. Can you help us shed some light about their plight and how this latest development might change things around?
Well, the Kurds, they have built an autonomous administration since 2013 in northern Syria. And with the fall of the Assad regime, the new government in Damascus, they decided to attack these areas and try to integrate those territory inside the new state. And there's a lot of unconfirmed reports that there's an agreement between the Kurds and Damascus, but so far there's fighting going on. And a lot of Kurds are now afraid that this Islamist government in Damascus will take revenge on people that joined this administration. So there's a lot of fear among Kurds, and there's really no way for them to go out. And they felt left alone by the US, because they used to be the main partner against ISIS. I mean, for years, the US has supported Kurdish-led forces that also, by the way, included Arabs and other minorities that fought ISIS. But now the US is basically working with Damascus. And now the Kurds, they feel abandoned, and they are preparing for the worst.
Right. Taking a step back, when it comes to examine the influence of Russia in the region, when has Russia entered Syria and kind of sank its tendrils there?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons the opposition was in the past not able to defeat the Assad regime in Damascus was because of the heavy Russian air support to the Syrian army against the Syrian opposition rebels. But recently, because of the war in Ukraine, like, Russia got very much distracted by the war in Ukraine, and it was not able to support the Assad regime as much as in the past. And that's why the Syrian rebels, they were able to overthrow the government and create a new government. And that's why now the influence of Russia is very limited. Although Bashar al-Assad, the former president of Syria, he's supposedly still in Russia, and probably one of the demands of the new Syrian government in Damascus is to hand over Bashar al-Assad, the former president. But it's very unlikely that the Russians will do that. But still, the negotiations go on between the new government in Damascus and Moscow.
Right. And with Russia having a diminishing presence over there, do you think that may create another space for the Americans to maneuver there once again? Or do you think that it'd be either Israel or Turkey stepping in?
Well, I mean, America already has a very strong relation with the new government in Damascus, so they definitely have a big role. I mean, Damascus would have not been able to defeat Kurdish-led forces if not the U.S. abandoning them. So the U.S. has a very strong role, and also they still have the threat of sanctions. If Damascus do something that they don't like, they can still reimpose sanctions on them that they recently suspended. So definitely the U.S. has a strong role, and Russia's role is very, very weak. And you see in general that the U.S. is trying to impose its influence more in the region, not only in South America, but also in the Middle East. And for instance, now they're also putting pressure on the Iraqi government, and also they're threatening to strike Iran, which is one of the allies of Russia. So far, there's no indication that the U.S. will soon hit Iran. There are now more talks about a naval blockade of Iran. But Iran has been heavily supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine. And that's why also I think there's not much goodwill left anymore in European capitals for Iran, because they supported the war in Ukraine from Russia.
Right, and amidst all this development, we've had news that Putin is going to be meeting al-Sharaa, and I'm wondering what to expect out of these discussions.
Well, I mean, probably they're gonna exactly again discuss this presence of Bashar al-Assad and former regime remnants in Russia, and they will also talk about the future presence of Russian bases in Syria. And I think that's like the main focus. And of course, Russia had a strong link with the Syrian state in the past. So there's also other things to discuss. I mean, in the past, I think there were some discussions to print the money still in Russia for the Syrian currency. So, I mean, Russia had a very long history in Syria, so it's not that in one day this influence will be immediately finished. So we'll have to see what this discussion will go to.
Right, and do you think the Kurds will feel abandoned by the recent developments?
Well, they mostly feel abandoned by the Americans because the Russian role was already diminished. I mean, I talked with one of the Kurdish leaders, and he said Russia doesn't really play a role anymore like in the past. So they mostly feel abandoned by the US that basically said, well, now that there's a new government in Damascus, we don't need the Kurds against ISIS anymore. But the Kurds warn that the current government in Damascus actually consists of people with an Islamist background, ex-Al-Qaeda, and they could actually pose also a security threat to the West in the future, but that's not how it's perceived in Western capitals so far.
And where does Turkey fit in all of this?
Well, since the fall of the Assad regime, Turkey has a very strong with the new government in Damascus. I mean, they had also strong relations with the rebel groups, but basically took over Damascus and Idlib. There used to be the Turkish army there, so they have a strong link. And there's almost daily relations between Damascus and the Turkish government. And you also see that with the Kurds, that there's a very strong coordination between Turkey and Damascus. And every time that Syrian armed forces were not able to advance in Kurdish-held territories, that Turkey would hit them with drone strike Kurdish forces. So there's a very strong link between Turkey and Syria on the military level, but also economically and politically.
Right, and looking at the bigger picture with the volatile regions such as the Middle East with these recent development and shifting of power, do you see a wider butterfly effect, a bigger impact around the region?
Well, I mean, in Iraq, they're starting to get nervous about what's happening in Syria because the Iraqi government is dominated by Shia political parties, and they don't really perceive the new government in Damascus to be friendly of them because they see them as Islamist. Should also not forget that in the past, jihadists coming from Syria, they were carrying out attacks in Iraq on the US forces and also on Iraq. And the same people that now rule Syria, I mean, Ahmed al-Sharaa, or previously called Julani, he used to be in the US prison in Baghdad, and he used to be in Iraq. So the current government in Baghdad, the Shia majority government, they are a little bit nervous about what's going on in Syria, and they are afraid that it could also spill over into Iraq and, for instance, empower Sunni forces in Iraq.
All right. Thank you so much for helping us unpack the issues in this region. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
You're welcome.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. A new Russian law has made it significantly harder for Ukrainian families to leave Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine.
Since January 20th, children under 14 are barred from traveling abroad without a Russian international passport, according to the Russian Interior Ministry's migration service. Rights organizations say that the measure is another feather in the cap of Moscow's efforts to force Ukrainians under occupation to acquire Russian citizenship. It follows a March 2025 decree signed by Vladimir Putin requiring residents of occupied territories to regulate their legal status under Russian law or leave. Experts warn that the rule effectively prevents families from quickly evacuating their children from occupied areas, particularly those facing political pressure or security risks.
New Russian investigative guidelines indicate that law enforcement officers may use physical force to gain access to suspects' mobile phones, including compelling individuals to unlock devices using facial recognition.
The document also recommends the presence of police officers in case physical force or legal coercion is deemed necessary during investigative actions. Legal experts note that the guidance appears to contradict Russia's constitution, which guarantees protection against self-incrimination and safeguards the privacy of correspondence and communications. Under Russian law, police may seize a phone as evidence, but are not authorized to force a suspect to unlock it without a court order.
Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Serhiy Boyev said that the country plans to produce up to 7 million military drones in 2026.
Kyiv has roughly doubled drone output each year since 2023, reaching at least 4 million units in 2025. This far outpaces U.S. production, which manufactures about 100,000 combat drones a year. Despite rapid growth, demand remains intense. Ukrainian brigades require thousands of drones per month as Kyiv seeks to expand the frontline kill zone deeper into Russian rear areas. Boyev said drones, air defense systems, missiles, and artillery ammunition will consume around 80% of Ukraine's projected $120 billion defense budget for 2026.
That's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TPP World.